This widely talked about case took place in the small provincial Italian town of Pirano in 1934. A 42-year-old woman named Anna Monaro was admitted to the hospital with severe asthma. The illness had worn her down, and on top of that, Anna developed hysteria. Her condition was serious, heavy, but the doctors didn't see her as doomed. No one was saying she was about to die. Anna was a simple fisherwoman. No one could have imagined that very soon her name would appear in the newspapers and that doctors and scientists would be discussing her specifically. It all began at night, in an ordinary hospital ward. The nurses noticed something strange. When Anna fell asleep, light began to emanate from her body several times a night. At first, they tried to ignore it, blaming it on fatigue, imagination, or reflections from the equipment. But the light came back again and again. It was so bright that it lit not only her own bed, but the neighboring ones as well. Sometimes it illuminated the entire ward, as if someone had switched on a powerful electric lamp on the ceiling. Only no one touched the switch, and the source of the light was the body of one specific person. Eyewitnesses said the light came from the area of her chest. It was as if a cone of flame grew out of Anna's chest, fanning upward and outward in rays. At other times, it behaved differently. It seemed to come out of her body, separate, and gather into a distinct ball hanging above her. This ball could hover over her chest, over her head, over the bed, and it shone like an independent lamp. Importantly, this wasn't a story told by one nurse. Many people witnessed the phenomenon. Nurses who were on duty on different days, doctors who were called in to come and see this miracle, later invited journalists and simply curious onlookers who were allowed into the ward. The glow was seen more than once, and not by just one person, and the accounts of different witnesses matched each other. In 1934, the illustrated Italian newspaper La Tribuna Illustrata published a drawing, a woman in a hospital bed, and above her body, a bright flame or ball of light. That's how not only Pirano, but the entire country learned about the glowing woman. The doctors tried to approach the strange phenomenon as soberly as possible. They hooked up Anna to all the equipment available at the time, monitored her pulse, breathing, and electrical activity in the body. They tried to determine whether there was some simple physical cause, phosphorescence, static electricity, anything at all. Essentially, they wired her up with sensors every time they were expecting another episode of glowing. But no matter how closely they watched Anna, no matter how much they speculated, not a single hypothesis could explain how an internal source of light could come out, gather into a ball, and then illuminate an entire room. The light was there, the witnesses were there, but there was no clear mechanism. The story quickly became a national sensation. Italian newspapers wrote about the glowing woman, and rumors spread far beyond Pirano. The story reached other countries as well. Foreign papers repeated that light comes from the chest of the signora at night, bright enough to light up the room, and that sometimes this light takes the shape of a ball. By this point, prominent scientists had become involved. 2 Nobel Prize winners, Enrico Fermi and Guglielmo Marconi, personally observed Anna's glow and did not question the reality of the phenomenon. In other words, this wasn't a case you could simply dismiss as superstitious nurses or overly emotional relatives. At the same time, outwardly, Anna didn't look like an icon of holiness. In photographs, she has a rather hard, even stern gaze. But one quality did stand out. She was an extremely devout Catholic. She lived strictly within church tradition, and her faith was sincere and deep. That's why many Italians perceived her story as a miracle. They compared her to saints whose lives described their faces shining and halos appearing around their heads. For centuries, icons have shown halos, and now it turned out that stories of light around real people also exist,
In Anna Monaro's story, several details came together at once: a grave condition, strong faith, multiple witnesses, media attention, and the interest of major scientists. All of this together created a case that is very inconvenient for simple explanations. A human being who literally glowed.
If Anna's story could be dismissed as a one-off miracle, what comes next is where things get truly surprising. Because this kind of light is described not only in her case, but in completely ordinary hospitals, hospices, and nursing homes all over the world. This phenomenon is often called near-death light. And it's important to clarify right away. We're not talking about the famous light at the end of the tunnel that the dying person supposedly sees. This is something else entirely. This is light seen by the people around them: nurses, doctors, relatives, other patients in the room. According to their accounts, at the moment of death or shortly before it, the room can seem to be touched by a soft glow. Sometimes it fills the entire space. Sometimes it feels like it's coming from the body itself, from the head, the chest, or from the outline of the person as a whole. It's not a flash, not a blinding beam, but a gentle, unusual light that simply wasn't there before. When researchers started interviewing medical staff, an interesting pattern emerged. From a third to half of hospice and hospital workers admitted that at least once in their life they had encountered something like this. Some had seen it only once, others several times over years of work. And now we're no longer talking about isolated stories from one odd nurse, but about a fairly consistent background of similar reports. Most often, these episodes happen around the dying, in the last hours or minutes. But there are stranger cases when the light is seen around the severely ill who are not expected to die at that moment. And sometimes even around people considered relatively stable physically, but going through a powerful inner crisis, severe depression, acute spiritual breakdown, a state of being on the edge. One particular detail keeps repeating. Some people in the room see the light, and others don't. Everyone is standing nearby, looking in the same direction. Some describe a glow, a halo, a radiance, and others honestly say, "I didn't see anything, just normal darkness." The lighting conditions are the same. The eyes are different. From here comes the idea that this kind of light may exist somewhere at the edge of the visible spectrum, just at the border of what we can normally perceive. And whether a person notices this glow or not may depend on the individual vision, sensitivity, and state of consciousness. In some traditions, for example in Scottish folklore, this ability is described as second sight, a special gift that is said to be passed down through families. It's interesting that similar themes appear not only in the oral accounts of medical workers, but also in old religious texts. In Christian lives of the saints, there are many stories of how, before death, the face of a righteous person began to shine, and the entire cell or room was filled with light. The people around them didn't talk about lamps or lanterns. They specifically connected this light with the person themselves. In Buddhist and Hindu traditions, there are also stories of masters and yogis who, at the moment of leaving the body, supposedly began to radiate light. Sometimes it's described not just as a glow around the body, but as the sense that the person is somehow dissolving into light, disappearing from ordinary perception. Of course, none of these stories are written up like laboratory reports, but they stubbornly recur in different cultures and eras. Languages change, religions and customs change, and yet the same theme remains. For some reason,
death and light often seem to walk side by side. Modern science still cannot confidently say, yes, we have recorded this effect with instruments. Here is the exact data. But the overlap of descriptions from medical staff, eyewitnesses, religious texts, and folklore looks at the very least odd. People seem to be talking about the same thing far too often. And this raises a natural question. If this light is not just a subjective picture in the mind, if it sometimes manifests so strongly that it can light up a room, as in the story of Anna Monaro, does that mean we could try to capture it, not with the eyes, but with something more objective, for example, on photographic film? At some point, that's exactly what a French doctor from the late 19th and early 20th century decided to do. His name was Hippolyte Baraduc, and he set himself a rather bold task: to try to photograph the moment when something separates from the body. That very something some people call the soul, others the life force. Baraduc reasoned simply. If, at death or during intense emotional states, something immaterial leaves the body, then maybe this something still interacts with matter, which means you could try to catch it on a highly sensitive photographic plate. Not a regular picture taken from a distance, but essentially a contact photograph with the plate placed almost directly against the person's body or head. His main, most famous experiment was connected to his own wife. She was dying, and from a human point of view, it looks quite harsh. Instead of just being there for her, he was at once both husband and researcher. Before her death, he prepared his equipment, preloaded the plates, and waited for the moment. When her breathing stopped, he didn't settle for a single shot. He took several photographs at intervals after her death, and on one of them, according to him, a hazy, smoky glow became visible above the body. It couldn't be seen with the naked eye, but on the developed emulsion, something showed up that hadn't been there before. The caption to the famous illustration stated that the picture was taken roughly 20 minutes after the presumed moment of death. Baraduc himself explained it as the soul, or the subtle part of the person leaving the physical body. Not as a metaphor, but literally. Here it is, the departed part, captured on the plate. Of course, it didn't end there. He continued his experiments. He photographed not only people but also animals, took pictures after death and tried to catch strange misty formations on the plate that, as he believed, corresponded to the moment the life force left. Sometimes something appeared, sometimes it didn't, but his conviction only grew stronger. At the same time, other experimenters of that era were trying to work in the same direction. They were interested not only in the moment of death, but also in the so-called astral projections. When a person is alive, but their subtle body is supposedly able to move away from the physical one. The setup for such experiments looked like this. They would take a person who, according to their own claims or the opinion of those around them, had the ability to leave the body. They would put this person into a hypnotic state and suggest that their astral body should go, for example, into the next room. There, they had already prepared either a photographic plate or some sensitive substances or delicate mechanical devices. The idea was simple. If this astral body is real, it should either imprint itself on the plate or somehow affect the prepared objects, shift them, disturb their balance, trigger a reaction, leave a trace. In Hector D'Urville's book, The Ghost of the Living, he describes exactly these kinds of experiments on how the astral body might influence substances. There's an entire chapter devoted to attempts to record this influence not with the eyes, but through physical traces. All these people, however strange their methods may seem today, were aiming at the same thing: to drag the conversation about the soul, light, and out-of-body exits out of the realm of mere stories and move it into the realm of objective records, photos, traces, measurable effects. Of course, on their own, images and smudges on plates didn't prove anything, but for them it was a first step, at least something beyond words. And here the next question inevitably arises. What exactly did they think was leaving the body? What is this subtle part that is supposed to glow, leave traces, and sometimes take the form of a ball or a mist? To understand their logic, we have to look at a model of the human being in which a person consists not of a single unit, but of several interconnected parts. To answer that question, the people doing these experiments leaned not only on medicine, but also on existing esoteric and spiritualist ideas about the human being. Those traditions had their own anatomy for a long time, made up not only of the physical body, but of invisible parts as well. Most often, they used a simple three-part model. The first part is the soul. It's described as almost immaterial, weightless, the true I, consciousness, character, memory, personality, something you can't measure with a ruler or see on an X-ray. The second part is the physical body, a dense, heavy shell, our suit through which the soul interacts with the material world, walks, talks, eats, works. In some texts, it's literally called a container or an instrument. And between them is a third intermediate part. French spiritualists called it the perisprit, the envelope of the spirit, a kind of layer between the soul and the body that both holds them together and connects them to the surrounding world. In other traditions, it's called the astral body, the etheric double, the subtle body. Many names, one idea. It's this intermediate part that is most often linked with the glow, the out-of-body exit, the fiery balls, and everything else we've been talking about. The soul is too subtle to manifest directly. The body is too coarse. But this in-between layer seems like it can both show up as light and leave traces. In normal life, all three parts, soul, intermediate body, and physical body, are tightly locked together. A person is awake, moving, and feels whole. But as soon as consciousness weakens or shifts state, that chain seems to loosen a bit. In sleep, deep trance, meditation, fainting, or severe trauma, the astral body can partially pull away from the physical. In esoteric literature, this is described as an out-of-body experience. Some people say they see themselves from the outside, some fly over their house, and some just wake up with the feeling that they were somewhere else. People who are said to have second sight supposedly see, at such moments, a glow around another person, a halo, a shifted outline, sometimes like a faint mist that slightly extends beyond the physical shell. When we're talking about intense states, for example, death, the separation, according to these ideas, becomes sharper. The astral body can move farther away, become denser, and sometimes take the form of a ball or glowing cluster. These are the very balls that keep appearing in stories about the dying, about the departure of the soul, about glowing people. In some accounts, this ball seems to break away completely. The body remains lying there, like an empty case, now only suitable for burial. Everything that animated it is already outside. In other stories, the ball can return, re-enter the body, and then people speak of a miraculous recovery or unexpected return to life, as if this something switched life back on. There are those who claim they can do this kind of exit consciously, a controlled astral projection, when a person tries, by an act of will, to leave the body, go somewhere else, and later describe in detail what they saw there. These are the people experimenters tried to work with under hypnosis, sending them astrally into the next room. But far more often, descriptions involve uncontrolled exits, during dying, during severe shocks, in extreme states where the person themselves no longer decides or controls anything. Something leaves the body on its own, and observers see light, mist, a ball, a sense of presence. Different cultures name and evaluate all these things very differently. Somewhere, it's seen as a high spiritual practice, part of the path of a saint or master. Elsewhere, it's viewed as dangerous sorcery, interference in another person's life, or even a weapon. And precisely in those cultures where magic and witchcraft are still part of everyday reality, the idea of the inner essence leaving the body has taken on especially vivid and sometimes dark forms. There, this essence is often described very concretely, as a glowing ball that can be physically felt or seen at night. In Central Africa, among the Azande people, there is a very specific concept, the soul of witchcraft, Mbisimo Mangu. It's not just an evil thought or a curse. It's believed that a witch can send a part of themselves to a victim, not metaphorically, but literally. Their inner essence leaves the body, flies through the air, and glows. By day, the Azande say, this light can be seen only by witches themselves, those who have the necessary gift. But at night, things are much more honest. Then, this fiery trail can be seen by anyone. They compare it to a firefly, only far brighter, unnaturally intense for an ordinary insect. Evans Pritchard, a British ethnographer who lived among the Azande and collected their stories, didn't just hear and write it down. One day he himself became a witness to what they had told him. Late at night, he stepped out of his hut and saw a bright light moving low over the ground from his servant's hut toward another man's compound. The light didn't illuminate anyone, didn't look like a lantern. It was just a compact glowing patch drifting through the air. By morning, the very man toward whose place the fire had flown was dead. The locals didn't need a long explanation of what had happened. They calmly told the ethnographer, "You saw witchcraft on its way to do its work." The light wasn't a lamp, it was the soul of the witch sent out on a mission. And this is not a one-off story. In many parts of Africa, the idea that a witch can leave the body in the form of a glowing ball is still not considered exotic. It's part of how people explain illness, sudden death, and misfortune. In colonial Ghana, things went so far that the authorities had to officially take this into account. One of the ministries created a special unit that was originally meant to fight corruption, theft, and extortion in road and port construction. But it quickly became clear that major criminals were not only taking money and hiding, They were also turning to witchcraft to protect themselves and intimidate witnesses. This unit was headed by a European, James Neal, chief inspector to the government of Ghana. As he worked, he gradually found himself dealing not only with accounting schemes and budget checks, but literally in the middle of a war with witchcraft. He had a local assistant whose uncle, it was believed, was a powerful witch doctor able to shield people from magical attacks. Neal was given protective rituals, amulets, and he no longer treated this as folklore, but as a necessary kind of insurance. According to his memoirs, people tried more than once to attack him astrally, through dreams, through a sense of a foreign presence, through strange coincidences. And one day, when he happened by pure chance to leave his house without his protective amulet, everything ended very badly.
He was climbing a long staircase at the racetrack. At that moment, according to witnesses, there was no one next to him, but people below saw how he was suddenly shoved hard in the back. He didn't trip, didn't slip. He was jerked forward, and only then did he lose his footing and fall. The fall was severe. He broke multiple bones, barely survived, and was left disabled. The locals had no doubt. There was no amulet. The protection was gone. Witchcraft got to him. In African magic, very physical objects also play a very big role. For example, bones. A human bone can be considered a carrier of power. Strong alcohol, whiskey, rum, is poured over it, while a special formula is spoken. If the bone absorbs all the liquid without spilling a single drop on the ground, then whatever sits in it is ready to act. After that, the victim is attached to the bone. A hair, a piece of clothing, any personal item is fixed to it. From that moment on, according to local beliefs, the witch has essentially launched a deadly program. Countless stories boil down to the same pattern. After such a ritual, the person soon dies, sometimes suddenly, sometimes after a short illness. There are also accounts of people trying to fight witchcraft, quite literally, with their bare hands. One such story. Villagers saw a glowing ball at night and decided it was a witch out hunting. They chased it, pursued it for a long time, drove it, until the light suddenly went out. In the very spot where the fiery ball had just been, they found an elderly, disabled woman, long believed to be a witch. Physically, she could not have gone far from her home, yet there she was at night, in the middle of nowhere, without crutches and without help. Modern studies, like the book Witchcraft and Violence in Ghana, show that stories like these are not relics of a distant past. People still talk about witches who appear at night as giant glowing balls, bouncing above the ground, perching on treetops, breaking apart into sparks, and then reforming. Similar stories are found far beyond Africa. In Latin and South America, such lights are called boles de lumbre, balls of fire. In Melanesia, Micronesia, Indonesia, in Chinese folk belief, everywhere we see the same image, a glowing ball associated with the departure of a soul or spirit, or with the work of witchcraft. And if we accept, at least as a working hypothesis, that a person's inner essence can leave the body in the form of light while they are still alive, then the next question is obvious. What happens when the physical body has finally died? Where does that light go after the funeral? And why is it so often sought exactly there, where the crosses and headstones stand?
Stories from different countries keep bringing up the same picture. A glow appears above fresh graves. At first, it looks like a vague halo, a faint mist floating over the ground. Then this mist contracts, thickens, and turns into a small, shining ball. This ball can wander around the cemetery for quite a while. It circles above one grave, flies over to another, hangs next to a cross or a fence. Sometimes it's seen several nights in a row, precisely over the spot where someone was recently buried. In some accounts, the ball quietly sinks back into the ground, as if returning to where it came from. In others, it rises higher and simply disappears into the darkness. There are darker versions. In those, if the glowing ball finds a living being nearby, a person or an animal, it flies toward them, clings to them, as if draining warmth and strength. After that, it returns to its own grave. Stories like this connect the light not only with the soul, but directly with vampirism, with the idea of feeding on the living. In Eastern Europe, legends about vampire graves grew directly out of this. People believed that certain dead did not rest at night, not necessarily in their physical bodies, but reached out to the living and literally took their life energy. In villages, this wasn't treated as a fairy tale. If one family member after another began to fall ill and fade, suspicion fell on a recently deceased relative. When people became convinced that someone isn't lying still, they would open the grave. They tried to destroy the body as reliably as possible. The head was cut off and placed at the feet. Sometimes the corpse was turned face down. Iron objects, nails, spikes, rods were driven into the hands, feet, chest. Iron was considered a dependable barrier to any unclean activity. And this is not just spooky fireside storytelling. Archaeologists studying old cemeteries in the Czech lands and other parts of Eastern Europe have indeed found burials where skulls were severed and the skeleton was pinned with iron nails. In other words, people didn't just believe in vampires, they took very practical steps to stop them. Against this background, another thought arises. Today, in almost every country, a post-mortem autopsy is mandatory in suspicious deaths. If we imagine that the body has some kind of subtle structure connected to glowing and the release of something outward, then a surgical cut might literally tear those structures apart. In that case, there would be fewer post-mortem lights. The body reaches the cemetery already in a neutralized state. This is, of course, only a hypothesis, but it lines up curiously with the fact that most stories about graveyard lights come from times and places where no autopsies were performed.
And now we move into the 20th century, into very recent times. One of the most famous cases is Silver Cliff Cemetery in Colorado, USA. It's a small cemetery with no streetlights, no electricity, no nearby houses that could cast light. Yet glowing balls were regularly seen hovering above certain graves. They rose slightly above the ground, flickered, and moved around. When the rumors reached the press, a reporter from National Geographic was sent there, officially to check on local superstitions. In the end, he himself saw the lights with his own eyes at night, tried to walk after them, even to photograph them. The images turned out blurry, but the main thing is that he personally admitted the phenomenon didn't look like an invention. It was really there, in front of him. A similar story comes from Canada. Near the towns of Taber and Esterhazy in Saskatchewan, in 1938, people observed mysterious lights above graves. These lights didn't hang motionless. They behaved as if reacting to the presence of people, changing direction, maneuvering, sometimes moving away when someone tried to get too close. In one American case, at a cemetery near the town of Crystal Lake, someone finally managed to take a more or less clear picture. The photo shows a wavy streak of light, the result of the witnesses shaking hands as they tried to hold the camera still, and the dark lines of a grave fence. If you unfold that trajectory, the ball itself was small and roughly round. Similar lights over graves are described at Chinese cemeteries as well. Local folklore even has separate stories about them, mysterious balls that appear above burial sites and vanish just as suddenly. One important detail in all these accounts: people insist that this is not ball lightning. Ball lightning appears under specific weather conditions, usually during storms, and lasts fractions of a second or just a few seconds. Here we're talking about regularly observed lights in burial grounds, most often over fresh graves, in clear weather, sometimes on many nights in a row. And as if that weren't enough, sometimes an additional layer of strangeness appears around these post-mortem lights. Over a cemetery where glowing balls are already being seen, people suddenly notice not just little lights, but unidentified objects that behave as if they have come not simply to look, but to take from the graves what we cannot touch with our hands.
In one of these episodes, an object that witnesses took to be a UFO approached a cemetery and didn't circle over the whole field. It seemed to know exactly where it needed to go. It quietly stopped and hovered over a fresh grave where the earth was still loose and hadn't yet settled. Not over an old burial, not somewhere nearby, but precisely over the site of a recent funeral. From the underside of the object, a beam of light came down. It seemed to work over the area of the grave, lingering at a particular point. The people watching from a distance described almost the same feeling, as if something was being drawn out of the grave, not by hands, but by that very beam of light. Later, when they finally opened the grave, the body was there. All the belongings buried with the deceased were there as well. Nothing material had disappeared. If the object took anything from underground, it clearly wasn't something you could weigh or touch. More likely something energetic or informational, to use very rough language. Against this backdrop, another pattern becomes visible. People see similar objects not only over cemeteries. They're reported over battlefields, over morgues, over funeral homes, places where death comes in large numbers over a short period of time, where, if you follow this logic, a lot of inner light might be released. Another layer of this topic is the stories of people who claim they were taken aboard such objects. And this is where a detail appears that completely undercuts the usual science fiction storyline. In a noticeable number of accounts, witnesses say they saw the dead there. Not abstract souls, but very specific people. Some saw relatives who had already been buried, some neighbors or acquaintances. Sometimes they described completely unfamiliar faces, people who were lying on tables, like in a pathology lab, motionless, like corpses. And if someone on board recognized a deceased acquaintance, very often, that person didn't look like a ghost, not a transparent figure, not a cloud of smoke. They looked alive, healthy, and physical. They moved, talked, wore strange clothing. One Russian witness, the artist Malyshev, said that on another planet he met his dead neighbor there. The man was walking around in an unusual jumpsuit and looked like an ordinary living person, even though he had been buried on Earth long before. Researchers of such stories keep running into the same question. How do you fit into one coherent picture non-human beings and at the same time
the presence of people we consider dead. If this is just alien scientists who came to study biology, then how do our departed neighbors end up in their labs? To show just how multi-layered this can get, people usually cite one particularly complex case, the story of 12-year-old Juan Perez from Argentina. The events took place in 1978, near a spot known as La Mina or La Minata Tuerta. Juan came from a poor family and helped the adults from an early age. He herded horses. In the evenings, his task was simple: gather the animals into a group and bring them home. That day, everything was normal until several silvery objects appeared over the field, sending beams of different colors down to the ground. The horses panicked and began to run. The boy barely managed to calm his own horse, ran home, but his father insisted he go back and finish the job. Saucers or no saucers, the horses still have to be brought in. When Juan went back out into the field, he saw that one of the saucers had landed. An opening appeared in its shiny hull, and a staircase extended down. A tall being, over 2 meters high, descended the steps, wearing a protective suit that looked like a kind of biological spacesuit. From the helmet, a thick tube ran back into the craft, as if the being refused to breathe Earth's air. The boy peeked inside and saw something he would remember for the rest of his life. Blinking panels, little lights, something like a science fiction control console, and a horse being cut up inside. The scene horrified him, and he tried to run. The being caught up with him and grabbed his arm. He remembered the grip as clawed. The creature's fingers felt like talons. In that moment, he felt he was losing not just the ability to fight back, but his very will. It was as if someone had switched off the "I decide" button, and from then on his body was being handled without him. Later, doctors documented claw-like marks on his arm. At the spot where the craft had supposedly landed, investigators found strange traces and soil anomalies, which made it hard to write everything off as a child's fantasy. Juan himself said that after that, he felt as if he were being taken somewhere. Outside the windows, he saw stars or what he took to be a starry sky. At some point, they dropped him off in a strange place he couldn't really describe. There he saw his deceased grandfather. The man was doing something, looked alive. And then they showed Juan a kind of black zone, something dark, like a brownish wall moving forward and destroying everything. After that, he was brought back and returned to his normal state. The story drew heavy skepticism. Some argued that part of what he experienced might have been suggested, part dreamed, part distorted. But the landing traces, the injuries on his arm, the behavior of the animals, all of that was confirmed without hypnosis or embellishment. That's why cases like this can't be forced into one simple category. Very often, they intertwine real physical events that witnesses actually encounter with images that may be imposed, shown, plugged into their consciousness. But no matter how different these stories are, the light of the dying, witchcraft spheres, lights above graves, strange craft over cemeteries, encounters with something other, the same motif keeps resurfacing. Glowing balls coming out of a body, flying from a witch, rising above a grave, or shooting out of a UFO. And it's precisely this recurring image that many researchers today look at as a possible common denominator, one they believe is worth examining separately.
In a restless house where poltergeist activity is reported, such a sphere is usually called a spirit, a ghost, or a manifestation of unclean forces. In a cemetery, it becomes the lights of the dead, the souls of the departed, sometimes even a sign of vampiric activity. In anomaly zones, it's simply a strange glowing ball, while those who like scientific-sounding terms call it a plasmoid.
If a ball flies out of a strange craft and then returns back into it, people call it a probe, a scout, a messenger from a UFO. In stories of witchcraft, it's the soul of a sorcerer or the spirit of an ancestor. In religious accounts, it's the glow of a righteous person or a subtle body. The names change depending on context, culture, and expectations, but the shape stays the same. That doesn't automatically mean all these spheres are the same thing in nature, but the very fact that the sphere is such a universal form at least makes you wonder, are people using similar words to describe very different things? Or are different cultures trying, each in their own language, to explain something common? Ball lightning also comes to mind, a rare but officially recognized natural phenomenon. It too appears as a glowing sphere, sometimes hangs in the air for a surprisingly long time, can drift around a room, approach people, and seem to examine objects that aren't even good conductors of electricity. Its behavior can be very unusual. Among the theories about ball lightning, there are some that treat it not just as a purely electrical discharge, but as a phenomenon that might interact with something non-material. The idea of an energy overload appears. If there's a very strong spike of energy at a certain point in space, then what is normally invisible may become visible, having absorbed this excess energy and started to glow. In different stories, witnesses stress that glowing spheres sometimes respond to human actions. They move away when people approach. They hover nearby. They seem to watch someone's movements. They can also interact with technology, slipping out of radar coverage, or on the contrary, seeming to fly toward a source of radiation. In other words, they don't behave like a passive lump of plasma, but like something that chooses.
From here, another line of thought appears. If mind or consciousness can exist in a disembodied state, not necessarily inside a physical body, then a glowing sphere could simply be a form of manifestation or a kind of vehicle for such a consciousness. In that form, air, gravity, germs, temperature no longer matter. It can move freely through environments that would be deadly for a normal organism and scout new places without risk. In the same vein, there's the hypothesis that some objects perceived as UFOs may be ghosts of destroyed craft. Once upon a time, they were real machines, perhaps belonging to another civilization or something else unknown, but they were lost in a catastrophe, a war, a cosmic event. What we see now is not their physical hulls, but a kind of trace, a ghost copy. On Earth, this idea has long been present in folklore. Ghost ships, phantom trains, carriages, cars, airplanes that people claim to see, even though no real object is there anymore. If we allow for the possibility of ghost technology here, then in principle we can imagine ghosts of someone else's craft that once were real. A separate layer of this topic is explored in detail in Kenneth Ring's book, The Omega Project. He compares the experiences of people who reported UFO encounters with the accounts of near-death experiences. It turns out there are clear parallels between them: feelings of leaving the body, altered perception of time, encounters with beings from the other side, the recurring theme of light. His conclusions fit neatly into the mosaic that forms out of all these observations, from glowing dying people to strange craft over cemeteries. Instead of putting a hard period at the end and saying, now everything is clear, what opens up here is really a field for discussion. There's a whole line of stories in which the same elements repeat: light, spheres, out-of-body exits, strange objects, the dead behaving as if they were alive. From there, each of us, viewer, listener, host,
can decide for themselves how to connect these motifs and what they point to. One big phenomenon showing up in different ways, or many separate processes that only look similar on the surface. Dear friends, have you ever seen anything like this with your own eyes? And do you believe that when the soul leaves the body, it radiates light? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.